Okay. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'm Ellen Madison, a trustee here at the Babcock-Smith House, and I know 99% of you, so that's nice to have you all here. And before I introduce Sophia, I want to remind you that there are wonderful guides sitting right here in this audience who are just waiting to take you on a cemetery tour, July 9th at 6 o'clock in Riverbend. And every year, as you know, we do a different tour. This is on monuments in the midst of monuments because it's sort of in the middle of the cemetery. And we have found a lot of whaling captains and other important families that we'll be talking about, as well as the Granite. We are live streaming this on Facebook. So this is an experiment. We had a long-term planning session this week, and this is one of the things we said we would try. So you as an audience are guinea pigs. We're hoping that it works well, and we're excited about that. And of course, it will be on YouTube afterwards. So, Hugh, you find a chair here? Yeah. And Hugh would have been one of those excellent guides, but he has a foot and leg issue, so he will not be guiding, but he'll be there with us in spirit. So Sophia Kamp came to us last year in the middle of winter on a cold, snowy weekend to investigate the Smith Granite records about stained glass in the mausoleums. She is going to introduce herself and tell you the rest of the story, but some of you may have seen that really snowy picture where several of us went to Riverbend with her, and it was freezing cold and nasty. Didn't dissuade her. She's back, and we are delighted to have her with us to talk about her adventures with stained glass. All yours, Sophia.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here. It's lovely to be back in Westerly in the summer. I'm really enjoying it, though I did enjoy the snow as well. That was its own experience. As Ellen mentioned, I'm Sophia Kamp, and I'm the Stained Glass Research Associate at Woodlawn Cemetery. I'm so excited to be here today to discuss the research that I've been doing this past year on the Woodlawn Stained Glass Survey. In this presentation, I'm going to give a summary of this large, ongoing survey project. I'll provide a few examples of research discoveries and methodologies for researching unsigned stained glass windows, and I'll discuss the research I conducted here at Babcock-Smith in the Granite archives. Woodlawn Cemetery, located in the Bronx in New York, was founded in 1863 and is the burial ground of some of the most wealthy and famous citizens of New York. It was envisioned as a unification of landscape and architecture in a moment when crowded urban cemeteries were being replaced by park-style rural cemeteries. Woodlawn is particularly exceptional for its elaborate mausoleums, miniature palaces that form whole neighborhoods of the dead. Behind the doors of these mausoleums is an enormous collection of amazing stained glass, largely from the late 1870s to the 1920s. These masterworks have been virtually untouched and unseen since their creation, making them extremely valuable resources for learning about stained glass in America, from both a conservation and research perspective, as well as remarkable works of art in their own right. The Woodlawn Stained Glass Survey was born in 2020. At that time, Nani Frelinghuysen, curator of American Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Susan Olson, Woodlawn's Director of Historical Services, saw the potential for Woodlawn's enormous and untouched collection to expand stained glass research through a large and geographically contained survey, while also providing Woodlawn's lot owners with the tools to conserve and care for these stained glass windows. We aren't totally sure how many windows there are at Woodlawn. Not every mausoleum has a window, and some have multiple. We put the number somewhere around 1,200 stained glass windows. Part of the importance of this survey is in truly creating a definitive record of this collection. We were so excited that the project was featured in the New York Times this past March. It was so much fun to have the author, John Freeman Gill, come along on the survey with us, learn about our work, and experience Woodlawn's collection. Woodlawn's stained glass collection includes signed works by well-known makers like John Lafarge, G. Owen Bonawit, and Helen Maitland Armstrong, whose work can be found in museums, churches, and universities across the country. A significant number of the windows at Woodlawn are documented or attributed to Tiffany Glass and Decorating Company and Tiffany Studios, its later iteration. These windows are part of what makes Woodlawn so special. Woodlawn is likely the largest in situ collection of works by America's master of stained glass, Tiffany. However, the vast majority of the collection, including many incredible works of art and craftsmanship, are unattributed. What I find really amazing about the windows at Woodlawn is the wide variety. Every time we are there surveying, going into mausoleums, we see opalescent landscapes, jeweled ornamental windows, painted figures, and much more. Not everything is exceptionally beautiful or well-made, but everything is really interesting. There is something incredibly magical about pushing open a door and seeing the multicolored rays of light fill the space. It's evident that one is entering a private space, one rarely entered in the last 100 years. Sometimes it's quite sad to consider the loss and grief that precipitated the commission of its stained glass. At other times, it's just so exciting to see an amazing piece of craftsmanship that has been rarely seen since it was made. Woodlawn's stained glass survey has a dual purpose: documenting the material condition of the windows and providing conservation recommendations, while also pursuing historical research on the collection to learn more about who made the windows and the circumstances of their creation. The project is lucky to have an amazing team of scholars and conservators working on it. Brianne Van Voorst, the owner and principal of Liberty Stained Glass Consulting, leads the conservation survey, and it's her conservation recommendations that are being provided. Nani Freelinghuisen, who I mentioned previously, as well as Drew Anderson, who's the stained glass conservator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, both lend their expertise to the project. And Lindsay Parrott, who is curator and executive director of the Neustadt collection of Tiffany glass, is another invaluable member of the team. I became involved with the project while I spent the year prior to this as the Tiffany & Co. Foundation intern in American Decorative Arts at the Met. Nani and I would come to Woodlawn nearly weekly, and I fell in love with the collection, the team, and the unique opportunity to work so closely with objects and with conservators. I never would have anticipated that my art historical research would lead me to work at a cemetery or learn as much about cemeteries as I have. However, when I was in high school, I did take a multiple choice career aptitude test, and I was told I should be a mortician or a funeral planner, so perhaps this was meant to be. I don't know what you say on a multiple choice test to get those answers. Our conservation survey documents all aspects of the window's current state and provides recommendations for its treatment. The survey has grown and changed in the past 4 years that the team has been working, and for me, it's been a really amazing way to learn about how stained glass is made. Because the late 19th and early 20th centuries were a period of intense innovation in stained glass making, it's very valuable to have a study collection of this size that covers so many years of that period and employs so many different techniques and materials in order to understand how they age in different environments and how stained glass makers were experimenting in this period. As an art historian, it's very rare to have the opportunity to learn about art in close collaboration with conservators who understand how it was made and with unrestricted access to the objects themselves. The fact that each of these windows remains in the space for which it was made is a remarkable opportunity to see stained glass, a medium which is so tied to its surroundings in the way it was intended. However, it also means that the windows are frequently in poor condition and in dire need of conservation. Often, mausoleums are in disrepair. Sometimes they even have collapsed roofs or bowing marble walls. The condition of the environment around the window has a significant impact on its condition itself. Exposed paint is frequently seriously deteriorated, as you can see in that window, or windows are significantly bowing, that is, bending in or outwards. In other cases, windows have been vandalized or even stolen, as you can see in that central panel, and then with the missing head on that Jesus figure. It's surprising the number of heads that were vandalized off of figures of Jesus. That was kind of a popular thing for vandals to attack, which is pretty upsetting, particularly because it's very difficult to match the glass that was used at the turn of the century, so it will be very difficult to replace that central missing piece. The focus of my work at Woodlawn, and what I'm here to talk to you about in particular, is the research portion of this project. Our ultimate goal is to produce a catalog of Woodlawn's window collection, which is not a small goal. As you heard, there are somewhere around 1,200 windows. A significant part of this is gaining a better understanding of who made the windows, and this has been the focus of my research this past year. Attributing even some of the windows at Woodlawn could build significant bodies of work for the many stained glass studios working in America at this time and making uncredited masterworks. A range of actors were involved in the purchasing and construction of mausoleums at Woodlawn. Wealthy family lot owners purchased the lot and gave the foundation order. The cemetery themselves laid the foundations for the mausolea, and monument building companies built the mausoleums themselves. Where do stained glass windows fit into this dynamic? Did the family pick the stained glass studio and design themselves? Did particular monument makers have relationships with particular stained glass studios that they were more likely to work with? Furthermore, a wide variety of designs and iconography appear at Woodlawn, including biblical scenes, crosses, ornamental windows, landscapes, and even portraits of the deceased. How would one go about picking the design for a mausoleum window? Was there an idea of taste, propriety, and fashion for these art pieces that were seen mainly by the deceased? Mausoleum windows are a really unique and fascinating art form. In the historical moment when vast displays of wealth in the form of elaborate homes and philanthropic construction were the norm amongst the very wealthy, these expensive windows and mausoleums seem to make sense as testaments to the wealth and power of their owners. However, unlike a memorial window in a church or a domestic window at the top of a grand staircase, these windows would be seen by very few, and most of the time by nobody. In that way, they reflect both this kind of gratuitous display of extreme wealth and ego and the private beliefs of their owners about spirituality, beauty, and death. As you can see, this project raises a lot of questions. Answering them has not been easy. The collection presents numerous challenges. Its scale, which makes it so valuable and interesting, also makes it an enormous undertaking and a very hard one to organize. Windows are largely unsigned, and mausoleum windows were not advertised or covered in the press in the same way that memorial windows in churches were, which makes the research much more difficult. Woodlawn's records are held by the Avery Architectural Library at Columbia University. However, Woodlawn's records do not contain information about the windows because stained glass studios were essentially subcontractors of the monument maker who had no interaction with the cemetery themselves. So this enormous collection of documentation of the building of mausoleums at Woodlawn provides no information about who was making the stained glass windows. Another challenge is that we don't actually have accurate dating on the windows. We know the date of the foundation order for the mausoleum, so when the mausoleum was built, but we don't know that the particular window that we're looking at was made and installed at that time. Sometimes windows were replaced later. Sometimes they would put a plain sheet of glass there until the window was ready. So it's difficult for us to assign a precise date to the window until we find some sort of record of its purchase. There are several different methods that I've been pursuing for researching windows at Woodlawn. Does the window use particular kinds of glass, painting, or plating techniques, that is the layering of glass in a stained glass window, that we've seen elsewhere at the cemetery or elsewhere in a church? These kind of connections between construction techniques help us build a body of work, and when we attribute a single one of those windows, the whole group can follow. This is kind of similar to how the research is done on furniture, where a certain furniture maker will have a particular hallmark technique, and then you start to look at multiple pieces of furniture and attribute them to their body of work. Additionally, understanding the iconography of a window can lead to the source material for the window, which I'll discuss a bit later on, or to similar windows, which again helps you build this kind of body of work. The family that purchased the mausoleum and window could be a particularly important source of information. Did they purchase windows from a particular stained glass studio for their home? Do they have family archives that might include information on the window purchase? So far, we haven't had much luck finding family archives relating to windows at Woodlawn, but in the last 2 months alone, I've had 2 very exciting leads where families have actually reached out to us, having heard about the project, and said that they think that they might know who made their window. Unfortunately, now I have to hound them by email to get them to actually share the final bit of that information with me, but it'll come slowly but surely. Monument makers, those who actually built the mausoleums, have so far been a very interesting point of entry to make connections between windows. The archives of monument makers, which is what made Babcock-Smith such an exciting place for me, can include information about stained glass studios they work with and their process for acquiring stained glass windows for mausoleums. Another useful source is stained glass studios publishing their work in periodicals, as they sometimes did. Actually, one of the most valuable sources our team has had is the years of expertise of the people on the team. Nani, Lindsay, Drew, and Bree are very familiar with the work of certain stained glass studios, having studied them for about 4 decades now, and these years of study greatly aid with attribution. One case of expert attribution is this window, this one here, which when Nani and Drew, that's the curator and the conservator from the Met, spotted it actually from the back, from outside of the mausoleum, they immediately said, "I think that is Daniel Cottier." Cottier is a Scottish stained glass designer whose work is actually credited with bringing the aesthetic style and aesthetic taste in stained glass to America. You can see the close similarities between Woodlawn's Cottier and this window, which is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He often included these kind of elaborate floral compositions with interesting vases. This was a particularly exciting discovery because Daniel Cottier himself is buried at Woodlawn, where his grave is marked, "Art is long, life is short," and it's this beautiful Celtic cross. One of my favorite things about Woodlawn is the frequency with which we will see something that members of the team have never seen before, even though they've spent decades studying stained glass. This arts and crafts floral window, likely dating to the late 1920s, appears at first to be a simple and elegant leaded glass floral design. However, the back of the central portion is plated with a single piece of rolled glass, upon which the design of roses and leaves has also been painted, presumably to enhance the color on the front. So this exact design that's been made with leaded glass is imitated on the back with paint, which is something we had never seen anywhere before. It's evident that stained glass makers were really experimenting in this period with mixed results. We couldn't decide how effective this was, even though we did find it very interesting. This window is unlike any other we've seen at Woodlawn. It incorporates pieces of Renaissance stained glass, as well as early 20th century pieces which are given the patina of age to match the historical ones. It's really interesting to consider who made this window and the degree of involvement from the family. How do you end up with a window that looks like this and looks so different from the other windows at Woodlawn? Upon researching the family who commissioned this window, I discovered that the son was a major art collector who gave much of his collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art at the time of his death, including a Renaissance stained glass window. Based on this, it seems plausible that the window is made up of glass fragments that he himself collected, making it, if so, a wonderful testament to his interest in the art of stained glass. My personal favorite kind of window at Woodlawn are mausoleums that have a whole group of windows that work together in conjunction with the complete interior of the mausoleum. These windows in a richly mosaicked mausoleum show the instruments of the Passion, and the central window shows a mourning woman in the lap of Mary, with a dead child on the floor to their right. Images of children in mausoleum windows are often an indication that an infant is buried there, like in this case, which is a particularly tragic reminder that these windows are the manifestation of grief and loss. This window also demonstrates another common feature of stained glass windows at Woodlawn, borrowing designs directly from popular paintings. In this case, the central window adopts William Adolphe Bouguereau's The Virgin Comforter from 1875. Mausoleum windows often borrow designs straight from whatever religious paintings were popular in that moment. We have seen Bernhard Plockhorst's Guardian Angel adapted time and time again, clearly by different stained glass studios. None of these are made by the same person, but they're all using this exact design. One particularly interesting example you can see here on the right seems to replace the face of the angel with a portrait of someone real. This makes sense because the mausoleum in question was built at the time of the death of the family's 18-year-old daughter, who is likely the subject of this portrait. You can see how different and how much more period to the 19th century and early 20th century this face is than the other ones that are more directly adapting the painting. Sometimes understanding the iconography of the image brings us to the original model, as with this window showing the three fates and adapted from a 19th century painting. So we saw this window, we knew that this was the three fates, and then that allowed us to figure out exactly what they were copying. I find it really interesting that the nudity has been covered up in the stained glass version of this, which it does make sense given that it is in a mausoleum now. There is definitely evidence we found to indicate that monument makers who built the mausoleums that house these windows had relationships with particular stained glass studios that they were more likely to work with. I've learned that one monument company actually kept a scrapbook of stained glass designs from various studios to show clients. Clients could then pick a design and it would be adapted for their mausoleum, and then it would be made by whatever stained glass studio the monument maker picked, whoever they were working with at the time, which really confuses things because those designs that the client is picking from might have been originally drawn but by a totally different stained glass studio than the one who ended up executing the commission. These two mausoleums by the maker Frank Lang, both dated to 1922, are identical architecturally and have quite stylistically similar windows in terms of the painting style, which suggests that the same stained glass maker made both of these windows for Frank Lang. It's also really interesting to see how incongruous the style of the mausoleum and the style of the stained glass window can be. In this case, these are strong Egyptian revival mausoleums, which is a popular style at Woodlawn, and these windows certainly are not Egyptian revival. Sometimes we'll find sort of Gothic style windows in an Art Nouveau mausoleum. There's very little thought to this complete effect in many cases. So this is the relationship that's become central to my research on Woodlawn's collection. The monument maker, the family commissioning the mausoleum, and the stained glass studio. were windows selected by the families themselves for their mausoleums or by the monument makers who built the structure. This is also where the archives here at Babcock-Smith became so important to my research. The Westerly-based companies Smith Granite and New England Granite both built mausoleums at Woodlawn or supplied the materials or supplied the mausoleums to the monument dealer Hamlin Q. French, who built a number of mausoleums at the cemetery. The records of monument makers, where they still exist, have shown me a lot about this relationship and been an invaluable source on Woodlawn's windows. On one very exciting day on the job, I discovered in Woodlawn's own storage, essentially in an attic, a day book of Robert Caterson, who was a monument company based right next to Woodlawn, basically right by the front gates, and who built many mausoleums at Woodlawn. This day book traced Caterson's day-to-day expenses, so paying salaries, paying for train tickets, just the minutia of this company's expenses. And in this entry from February 2nd, 1888, we see that Caterson paid J&R Lamb for a stained glass window for the Hayes Vault and paid them $45. There is a lot we can learn from this entry. Firstly, the window in the Hayes Vault, shown here, was made by J&R Lamb, America's oldest continuously operating stained glass studio. Secondly, the payment for this window was made about 6 months after Hayes placed the order for the mausoleum in July of 1887. So this gives us an idea of where the stained glass window is fitting into this timeline of the creation of the mausoleum. Thirdly, the window was ordered and paid for by the monument maker, not the family. The family is nowhere in this apart from their name being mentioned. This aligns with the relationship we see play out in the contracts between monument makers and clients, copies of which are held in Woodlawn's archives at Columbia. In a typical contract, the monument maker will allot a portion of the budget for the mausoleum to a window and promise to submit designs to the client from which the client could pick. This leaves the actual selection of the stained glass studio and the purchasing of the window up to the monument maker themselves. In large part, searching for the records of monument makers has been finding scraps here or there in Woodlawn's own files. That is what made Babcock-Smith's collection of order books from New England Granite and Smith Granite so exciting to me. I learned so much in the days that I spent going through every page of them in January. My interest in Babcock-Smith's collection began when Woodlawn's Director of Historical Services, Susan Olson, visited here last summer. She sent me just a few photos from her visit, and in this photo of a mausoleum order for Woodlawn, I noticed something in the top right-hand corner. A small pencil note indicates that the window for this mausoleum was $60. But even more excitingly, below that, it indicates the contractor for the window in parentheses. Right here, you can see contractor for. The name isn't the easiest to read, as you can see. So I had to sort of try different variations of what that could say in an index of stained glass workers that we had built based on business directories, and figured out that it likely refers to Frank A. Kirtland. I also think it's interesting to notice that they are charging the client $60 for the window, and Kirtland is charging them $50 for the window, so they are taking a cut. Unfortunately, the window that this refers to was the victim of vandalism, so we don't have a clear idea of what Kirtland's work looked like. However, this was enough that I knew I needed to come back to Westerly and carefully go through these order books. Brenda and John were kind enough to pull together a complete list of mausoleum orders in the books, and I went through every one of those, taking note of them even if they weren't at Woodlawn. References to windows were few and far between, but extremely exciting for me when they appeared. One 1912 order for a Woodlawn mausoleum from Smith Granite references that the windows were made by a company called Decorative Window Co. for $50, and the windows are shown here. I know, the prices vary enormously, as you'll see in my presentation, and I struggle sometimes to totally understand why certain things were so much more expensive. So who was Decorative Window Company? Based on a quick search of business directories, they were a Providence-based stained glass studio, active from about 1909 through to the 1940s. It was really interesting to take note of windows purchased for mausoleums at other cemeteries in order to get an idea of what studios Smith Granite worked with. One of the interesting things that emerged with this information was the geographical distribution of windows from different studios. In their order book, Smith Granite worked largely with 4 stained glass studios: DiCenzo, which was based in Philadelphia, Rudy Brothers, which was based in Pittsburgh, Decorative Window Co., as I mentioned, based in Providence, and Montague Castle London Company, which was based in New York. Most of the orders from Decorative Window Company are for cemeteries in Massachusetts or New York, and most of the orders from the Pennsylvania studios, Rudy Bros and DiCenzo, are for cemeteries in that region. This suggests that Smith may have had different studios that they preferred to work with depending on where the intended location of the window was, which makes sense. However, geographical distance is not a hard and fast rule for stained glass studios. In a record book from Leland Hall, which was another monument maker building mausoleums at Woodlawn, we see the monument maker bidding out the window to different studios. For this window, Montague Castle London Company bid $175, John Keller bid $90, the Edward P. Sperry Company bid $200, and Rudy Brothers bid $225. On the final cost for the mausoleum, you can see that the window cost them $225, indicating that Rudy Brothers was successful. This confirmed the attribution our team had already made of this window to Rudy Brothers, based on a similar window and drawing at the Rudy Brothers archive in Pittsburgh. However, it raises a really interesting question. Rudy Brothers was a Pittsburgh-based studio. Why were Leland Hall and the Flanagan family, for whom they were building this mausoleum, opting for the most expensive bid from an out-of-town studio when they had received more affordable offers locally? Clearly, selecting a stained glass studio was not purely a monetary decision and not totally based on proximity. New England Granite Company, on the other hand, seemed to have a particular relationship with one stained glass studio. Beginning in 1906, they ordered 12 windows from Montague Castle London Co. One very telling note is included in an order for a mausoleum at Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. Mrs. Stetson has selected a $700 window from Mr. Castle. We are to get commission of 10%, $70. It seems evident in orders from Montague Castle by New England Granite Company that he was offering them a trade discount, which they would then take as a cut of the total cost of the mausoleum. In May, the stained glass team at Woodlawn had the chance to visit Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia and view a selection of their stained glass windows. Partnership with other cemeteries is an important part of our project, and sharing research discoveries that I made at Babcock-Smith with those cemeteries has been a big part of that. While we were there, I viewed the Montague Castle window that cost $700. Unfortunately, it's not in good condition, and it's really difficult to get a clear idea of how it would have looked at the time of completion. The ones you find so often have issues with them, which is really painful. 2 windows by Montague Castle London Company were in New England Granite orders for Woodlawn. In this mausoleum order from 1911, the glass is credited to Montague Castle Low Co. for $33.75. Again, this fluctuation in prices is pretty enormous. In this 1914 order, Montague Castle London Co. is mentioned for a $100 window. In this case, they actually don't even mention the words glass or window. They just have the name Montague Castle London Co. in a whole list of people that they were purchasing, slate and marble from, which is why it's really important to know the names of stained glass studios while working with these archives so you know what to look for. And I did look into this a bit because I was so interested. Why was this one $100? Why was the other one $33? And this window is significantly larger. And then you can also see there's a lot more detail in this glass, a lot smaller pieces of glass. So it does make sense that this one was significantly more expensive. So who was Montague Castle London Company? This is a studio based in New York and active from about 1897 into the 1920s. Montague Castle was trained as a painter. He lived in Paris for 4 years. His father was a stained glass artist in Montreal, actually. And then he returned from Paris and started this studio in New York because, and he even said this in interviews, he knew that that's how he was going to make money as an artist, and he was about to get married. So he knew he needed to make money. This studio was actually already of particular interest to our team before I found the references in New England Granite books, order books, because of this ad, which they placed in American Church Almanac and Yearbook from 1921. The ad closely resembles a number of windows here at Woodlawn, suggesting that there are other works by Montague Castle and mausoleums here. This design, actually, we saw it at Laurel Hill as well. It's in a church in Southampton. So it seems like this might have been Montague Castle's sort of trademark design, or there are other studios copying them, because we do see some significant differences in the techniques being used in windows of this same design. In both of these examples from New England Granite mausoleums, Montague Castle is one of many contractors working with the Monument Company. They're listed next to the slate and marble companies, often in conjunction with the bronze company, who would sometimes also make the frame for the window. It's particularly interesting that they might have provided New England Granite with a trade discount so that New England Granite could take a cut, because it confirms the kind of special relationship between monument makers and stained glass studios that we've long suspected. This relationship fits with the patterns we've seen in the survey. Often, identical or very similar windows will appear multiple times in mausoleums from the same mausoleum maker. This is particularly exciting because it means if we identify the maker of one of these windows, we have a strong idea of who made the others. For instance, this design of a cross, crown, and flowers appears many times in mausoleums built by Lazary and Barton, a company based at the gates of Woodlawn who actually had a quarry here in Westerly. With a very helpful pointer from Hugh Barton, who I believe gave a talk here several months ago and is here with us today, from his research on the monument work of Lazary and Barton, I found several local newspaper ads attributing windows in Lazary and Barton mausoleums at Woodlawn to a local studio called the New Rochelle Art Glass Works, including one of those cross and flowers windows I showed on the previous slide. This works, a stained glass studio we had never heard of before starting this project. However, the stained glass studio was not always the pick of the mausoleum maker. In the case of the Cottrell window here at Riverbend Cemetery, which I was lucky enough to view on my research visit, the New England Granite Order Book specifies window not furnished and subtracts $100 from the total cost of the mausoleum. This suggests that the window was acquired by the family themselves, not the monument maker. This is particularly interesting given that the window is a beautiful example by Tiffany Studios. Our team has long theorized that Tiffany might have been a more personal and expensive pick for families who had encountered their work in some other way. Maybe they had used them for a memorial window or in a home, rather than simply a contractor in the same way that other stained glass studios were. Another important source for my research are publications from the period we're looking at. These include the records for the Architectural League of New York, Monumental News, Park and Cemetery, and the American Architect and Building News. One early discovery indicated that we needed to cast a wide net when we found a study for a window at Woodlawn in a magazine called Public Opinion in an interview with the artist, Gabrielle Shen, again, a figure we had never heard of before. Near the start of my time on this project, I found this J&R Lamb mausoleum window published in the Architectural League of New York yearbook for 1898, which is nearly identical to the window at Woodlawn. So interestingly, it's labeled here as being in a mausoleum that doesn't exist at Woodlawn. So this is definitely an image of a different window that just happens to exactly match one that we have at Woodlawn, suggesting that they were using this design multiple times. This attribution was later confirmed by the Lamb Studios archives at the Library of Congress, which have been an extremely fruitful source. The order for this window was placed not by the lot owner, but by Robert Caterson, the monument maker, demonstrating again what an important part of the process monument makers were. This window also demonstrates that stained glass studios would reuse designs for mausoleum windows, including at other cemeteries. Because of this, I'm really interested in reaching out to other cemeteries, learning what they know about their windows, sharing their windows that I found in the Lamb order books and in the order books here, and seeing those windows, just in case they happen to exactly match one that we have at Woodlawn. Researching stained glass is a complex puzzle with pieces that you find in totally unexpected places. As I'm sure you can tell, this project is just beginning with a lot of work yet to be done. One of our immediate goals for the future is this collaboration that I talked about with other cemeteries around the country. Woodlawn is not the only cemetery with an important stained glass collection. There's a lot we have to learn from them, and also a lot that needs to be done to protect these windows for the future. Another goal for the survey is the conservation of Woodlawn's windows. This is in process as we reach out to our lot owners and provide them with the results of this survey and ask them to join us in doing what needs to be done to make sure that these windows are in a good state for the next 100 years. We also plan to share the results of our research with the public when the project is further along. The scale of this collection has the potential to teach us a lot about the history of stained glass in America. Thank you so much for having me. I really look forward to questions or research suggestions from the audience. And it's such a nice full circle moment to be here talking about what I found in these order books several months after I was here doing the research. Thank you. I don't make stained glass. I didn't ever expect to be researching stained glass. I did my master's researching wallpaper. So I love niche architectural art forms. And then it was only when I was interning at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in this internship that really exposes you to all different kinds of decorative arts. And my lead supervisor was a stained glass expert and was taking me to Woodlawn. And at that point, I sort of realized how amazing stained glass is. Yeah.
Did most of these studios make their own glass, or were they buying glass?
Excellent question. So it depends on the studio. Tiffany was making their own glass. They had a glass making factory in Corona, Queens. Most other studios were buying their glass. And there were several different manufacturers of opalescent glass, which is this kind of hazy glass that is so quintessential to American stained glass of this period. Even say Lafarge, he was buying his glass, and he's widely considered Tiffany's main competitor and someone who was just as important to the development of opalescent glass as Tiffany, but he was purchasing that glass. He wasn't making it himself. But with regard to the question of were they just painting, one of the interesting things about this kind of stained glass is that usually the paint is only on the hands, the face, certain small parts of the design, and the rest of it is just coming from the glass. So one of the real skills in this was in the design of the window, so where the lead line should go, how you're putting this together, and the glass selection. So even if you weren't making the glass yourself, picking the right piece of glass to be a bit of fabric or some water is a really important skill. And at Tiffany Studios, that was largely done by women, which is a really interesting contribution they made to the art form.
Tell them what your next niche is.
Oh, well, yeah, I feel bad about this saying how much more work this project needs, but I am leaving this project. I always knew I wanted to do this for a year and go back to school. So in the fall, I'm going to be researching botanical illustration and publishing in London at Kew Gardens for my PhD. Thank you. um, which is similar dynamics of female illustrators and a little bit more documentation, which I'm excited for because this was a real like searching for scraps project, and it still is. But I'm going to stay involved. I can't let go of this. Yes.
Is there been any discussion with your group the use of AI, artificial intelligence, for attribution?
No, the closest we've come is asking ChatGPT where the archives of a particular monument maker were, just to see if they could come up with it. And they didn't. They lied to us. They said they were somewhere that didn't exist. No, I think that it's an interesting question. I remember being actually in my undergraduate degree and having a lecture on machine learning and art history, and the way that you can like, because they can look at so many things, they can understand the similarities between things. But I think at this point, true expert opinion is more powerful than AI for this work. Yeah.
So for Lazary and Barton, they list in their catalog Tiffany. Are there any Tiffany windows in the mausoleum?
Good question. So they list that they worked with Tiffany. Right. I'm sure there are Tiffany windows in Lazary and Barton mausoleums. I'm not sure off the top of my head if there are at Woodlawn. I can very easily look, actually, after I'm done with this, because we have, well, again, the survey is only underway. So we're at about 700 out of 1,200 windows. It started in 2020, but there was a lot of stopping and starting during COVID. So we do anticipate being done by the end of this year with the survey. But that does mean that the records I have only reflect what we have surveyed, and not the entire collection, which is still unknown.
So you mentioned the bronze, and I'm curious about that because one of the things that happened with the Garibaldi statue that in wherever it is, park in New York, Lazary and Barton was, the ones who placed the granite base, but it had gotten misattributed to them, and of course they didn't have a bronze foundry, so I eventually found something that said who the bronze foundry was. Have there been similar efforts to catalog the bronze? There must be amazing.
Yes, there is amazing bronze, and it's quite a similar situation where it is a challenge. It sort of stop and start efforts. In my research, I've come across, ads from bronze foundries that reference Woodlawn or reference specific mausoleum doors, that kind of thing. And I do collect that in case this is a future project, which I imagine it will be. It would be an enormous undertaking. One of the things we're most interested in are the bronze frames for the windows and who was making those. When I was looking at the Lamb Studios order books, there were sometimes quite detailed diagrams of what the frame should look like for this window, which was really interesting. And the frames frequently have two rabbets, so two places for glass to go, one for the window and one for protective glazing, which goes on the outside to protect the window, which was a relatively new innovation. A lot of church windows don't have that. It's kind of unique to the mausoleums. So it's interesting to consider that that was intended from the beginning. And the stained glass studio knew that that was coming and perhaps even selected that protective glazing themselves, which is frequently a kind of ribbed glass that diffuses the light that goes through and was used in shops and different places that wanted light diffusion. And so it makes sense that, say, Tiffany would want a particular diffusing light glass to make the windows, look as good as they can and not have too much intense light, which can throw off the design.
How did you pick the mausolea to do? Did you start with a certain geographical area?
Yes, we moved geographically by plot. So Woodlawn has, Woodlawn developed on a plot by plot basis over time. So because they didn't know how successful this endeavor of having the cemetery would be, and they didn't want to spread themselves too thin, so to speak, too much land, too big of a cemetery, which had proved an issue for other rural park style cemeteries. So we move plot by plot, and largely that means we're also moving chronologically, which is really nice. And we will find similar windows in neighbors, in mausoleums that are neighbors. For instance, the one I showed that was Frank Lang, that was those two Egyptian style, those were really close to one another. We saw those in one visit. So there's definitely a kind of, the people who were buried near each other often knew each other, and were like, this was also their neighbor on Park Avenue, being recreated at the cemetery. So those kind of geographical dynamics are quite interesting. Yeah. Yes.
Have you ever been refused entry to a mausoleum?
Yes. So, but not at Woodlawn. At Woodlawn, we are allowed to enter the mausoleums because we are essentially doing maintenance on them. These windows need to be surveyed for conservation. They need to be documented. So it's within Woodlawn's rights to go into them. However, other cemeteries don't always want people to go into their mausoleums, understandably. There were issues with theft in the past. They are private property. These are people's family mausoleums. So myself and Nani visited Homewood Cemetery in Pittsburgh, and they wouldn't let us into any of the mausoleums, which, that's their prerogative. And they've documented their windows really nicely. So we were able to go through a book of them. So it was all right, but yeah.
If you, in your research, if you find that lot owners have no descendants, who takes ownership and takes care of the maintenance of those windows?
That is a really important question, and it's Woodlawn. So if we can't find lot owner descendants, it's still Woodlawn's responsibility to care for all of this historic property. And Woodlawn's always searching for lot owner descendants to get in touch with them, let them know what they have here, or figure out that there are none and that the responsibility for it has passed to the cemetery. And that's actually, Woodlawn has two separate organizations, the Conservancy and the cemetery. The cemetery is an active cemetery that's selling lots and burying people. And then the Conservancy is a non-for-profit body that fundraises for Woodlawn and applies for grants and runs actually a program called the Bridge to Crafts Careers that trains young people in masonry and landscape restoration and turns all of these mausoleums and sculptures into kind of an outdoor learning lab where they learn these skills while also caring for these monuments that really need to be cared for. So it's kind of a win-win. It's been a smart innovation,
We see a lot of graves in Riverbend, but behind them it'll say perpetual care. And that means the family probably signed up for that.
Yes.
When they bought their lot.
Yes. So that is the same at Woodlawn. Mausoleums and graves can be endowed. So they set money aside for perpetual care. Woodlawn actually started requiring endowments for mausoleums in the early 20th century because they realized this was just not going to work. These were too expensive to maintain, and it was the family's job. So they needed the family to allocate those funds early enough. However, the cemetery was very limited in how it could invest these endowments because of New York state law around cemeteries and their own decisions, because it has to be really stable, basically. So it means that those endowments haven't really kept up the way that they should have if another organization had had them, and often more money than is in the perpetual care endowments is needed to actually maintain these structures. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.